Sometimes, those who long for order most deeply are the very ones who were born from the deepest places of unrest. Amid the gray mist of a distant morning in Handan, in 259 BCE, a child came into the world crying in a land that had never truly known peace. Outside that small room, the feudal states looked upon one another with suspicion. Blades had not yet dried after seasons of conquest, and the map of China then resembled a great mirror shattered into many cold, sharp fragments. No one knew that this fragile life would one day grow up to do what few would even dare imagine: force the broken pieces of the realm to close again into a single whole. But history rarely begins with the sound of galloping horses. More often, it begins with a very small fear resting in the heart of a single human being. Later generations would call him Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of a unified China, a name that sounds like mountain stone, like dark bronze, like straight roads stretching endlessly across high passes and broad plains. Yet before he became a symbol of power, of law, of colossal works and commands that traveled farther than the wind, he was only a child born in an age of chaos, raised amid suspicion, beneath guarded eyes, with the feeling of never truly belonging anywhere. And perhaps it was precisely there that a dream first began to take shape. Not merely the dream of defeating the rivals before him, not merely the dream of seizing the throne or forcing all under heaven to bow, but a dream deeper, greater, colder, the dream of a world no longer divided, of an empire with one script, one system of measurement, one currency, one road, one command traveling from the center to the farthest edges without being broken along the way. It was a longing that made him want not only to conquer land, but also to rearrange the very way human beings lived, thought, traveled, and understood order itself. In tonight's story from Deep Sleep of Power, we will not look at Qin Shi Huang merely as a figure standing high upon the summit of power. We will move more slowly, more deeply, as though placing a hand upon stone long cooled across 2,000 years, listening for the warmth that still remains beneath it. We will try to look at the child before we look at the emperor. We will try to look at the unease before we look at the empire. And we will try to understand why one human being could both give birth to a magnificent order and yet leave behind shadows so deep that history still debates them without end. If you love historical stories told slowly, deeply, gently, like a whisper at the close of day, please give Deep Sleep of Power a subscription and join us on journeys like this one, where power is not only victory, but also loneliness, dream, cost, and the very long shadows human beings leave behind for posterity. Tonight, as the light in your room softens a little more, let your breathing slow and step with us into the beginning of that story. For before there was an emperor who wished to unite all under heaven, there was a boy growing up in a foreign land, among murmured voices, in an age when even a roof overhead could not promise peace. And it was there, in the place that seemed most fragile of all, that the first seed of empire quietly settled into the earth, waiting for the day it would take root in the cold wind. Let the story slow a little. Slow like the morning mist settling over the old tiled roofs of Handan, where the sound of the wind seems always to arrive before the sound of human voices, and where silence can sometimes weigh even more heavily than a judgment spoken aloud. If the opening of Yingzheng's life was the cry of a newborn in a fractured age, then his earliest years passed through a space colder still. Not the battlefield, but a foreign land. Not amid the clash of blades, but among watchful eyes, whispers behind curtains, and the difficult-to-name feeling of a child growing up in a place where he was present, yet never truly belonged. At that time, Handan was not only the capital of the state of Zhao. For Ying Zheng and his mother, it was also a cage covered in ritual, rank, and the outward appearance of propriety. His father, Yiren, had once lived there as a political hostage, a human life placed upon the great chessboard of the feudal states. During the warring states period, hostages were not uncommon. States sent noble sons and heirs to other courts as guarantees for fragile agreements. But behind the courtesy of such diplomacy lay a cold truth. Human lives could become collateral for trust that rarely endured for long. A child raised in such an atmosphere often learns very early that peace is not something naturally given. It can be taken away by upheaval in a faraway place, by a change of mind among adults, by a single turn in the current of the times. Perhaps Ying Zheng sensed this very early, even before he was old enough to name the unease within him. His childhood, therefore, did not carry the gentle brightness that people often attach to one's earliest years. It bore the color of gray waiting, the gray of city walls not built to shelter, but to remind him that he was inside a place that could close itself at any moment. The gray of meals at which the adults may still have sat straight back to and spoken in measured tones, while in their hearts each of them understood that their fate did not entirely rest in their own hands. Growing up there, Ying Zheng must have become familiar with two sensations at once. He had to observe very carefully, and he could not reveal too much of himself. A child living in uncertainty often learns to read faces more quickly than he learns games. He begins to recognize which gaze carries pity, which carries suspicion, and which politeness exists only just enough to preserve appearances. And gradually, within that still very young soul, a seed quietly settled into the earth. If the world is not safe enough, then one must make oneself impossible to overthrow. Perhaps this was the first place where the suspicion of the man, later known as Qin Shi Huang, began to take root. But suspicion, in many cases, is not born from cruelty. It is born from prolonged hurt, from having to live too many times with no certainty about who would still stand by one's side tomorrow, from understanding that the smiles on adults' faces do not always mean loyalty, from feeling like a guest in the very story of one's own life. For an ordinary child, the feeling of not belonging may become sorrow, but for a man who would one day ascend to the summit of power, that feeling could turn into a very different longing, to seize the world so firmly that no one could ever push him to the margins again, to build an order in which role, rank, above and below, near and far, would all be clearly fixed, so that the ambiguity that once chilled his childhood would no longer have any place to hide. And so, when we look back at that Handan of his early years, we do not see only a historical setting. We see the quiet cradle of a caste of mind, a boy not yet strong enough to resist the age into which he had been thrown, yet already learning that chaos always hides beneath the surface of every fragile order. And once people have grown up with that feeling, they often carry it with them for the rest of their lives, just as those who pass through winter too early often remain wary of every wind thereafter. Perhaps later, when Ying Zheng wanted all under heaven to share one law, one voice, one road, one center, he was not thinking only as a ruler. Perhaps in a deeper and more hidden layer, he was also answering his own childhood, a childhood that had lived among fractures between one state and another, between inside and outside, between being kept and being cast aside. But history rarely allows a life to remain still within a single image. Around that boy in Handan, there was not only the strangeness of foreign soil, but also the shadows of adults falling across his fate through ambiguous stories, difficult debts of gratitude, and suspicions not easily washed away. His mother is a beautiful woman full of inner turmoil, the man who was his father in name, and another figure, both benefactor and the long shadow of power, waiting outside the door. Just as the morning mist not only blurs the road, but also the roots beneath it, the boy's lineage and identity would themselves become a quiet question, yet one deep enough to follow him through all the rest of his life. Let the rhythm of your breathing slow a little more. Slow like the thin veil of mist still lingering upon the old tiled roofs of Handan before dawn has had time to name all things. There are stories in history that do not appear in clear light, but in blurred outlines, as though time has deliberately left behind a half-shadowed place where later generations must look and guess and listen all at once. The lineage of Jing is such a half-shadowed place. Around the early years of his life, people always spoke of three names standing close together like three overlapping shadows beneath a flickering lamp: Zhao, Yiren, and Buwei. A mother, beautiful, fragile, yet full of complexity. A father living under the status of a hostage, surviving by the turning of state fortunes, and a merchant far too shrewd to stop at trade alone. A man able to see, in those who had fallen from favor, the opportunity of an age. From there, rumors began to grow, quietly yet persistently, like wild grass rising around an old wall, whose son the child truly was, what blood truly flowed in the veins of the future king, whether the roots of that power began in title and legitimacy, or in a calculation of extraordinary depth. Ancient history rarely gives us perfectly clear mirrors. It gives us tarnished bronze fragments, reflecting human figures in incomplete lines. And perhaps for that very reason, what matters here does not lie entirely in which rumor was true, or which version of events was accurate in every detail. What matters more is this: Jing grew up in an atmosphere where even his own origin did not stand wholly upon firm ground. For an ordinary person, doubt surrounding one's birth may remain only a private wound. But for one who would later place upon his head the heaviest crown under heaven, it could become a deep mark upon the way he understood power itself. For when one's roots are wrapped in mist, a powerful need often begins to grow. The need to build one's own legitimacy, not only through words but through achievement, not only through bloodline, but through compelling all under heaven to acknowledge oneself as an undeniable center. Perhaps it was here that a very fine thread first linked the childhood of Jing to the path of the man later known as Qin Shi Huang. Zhao appears in that story as a figure both intimate and distant. She was not only the mother of a future king, she was also a woman living amid upheaval, amid dependence upon the decisions of men and the turning of the age, amid changes that were not always of her own choosing. Her image in the historical record is far from tranquil. It holds beauty, ambition, weakness, and choices that later generations have long debated. However one chooses to see her, one truth still feels unmistakable. Jing's childhood did not grow within the simplicity and steadiness of an ordinary household. It grew amid layers of feeling and interest woven together, where his mother was the nearest place of refuge. yet the world surrounding her was never truly at peace. As for Buwei, he entered history as one of the most extraordinary figures of the Warring States period. A merchant who read the times as others read the price of goods. A man who understood that the greatest investment was sometimes not in gold or jade, but in the fate of a human being. It was he who helped Yiren rise from obscurity and gain the chance to return to Qin, drawing closer to the throne. And it was precisely because of that overwhelming presence that later generations never ceased asking, was he merely a great arranger of circumstance, or something deeper still? Those suspicions, whether true or false, created a very unusual condition for Jing. He did not grow up only beneath the scrutinizing gaze of foreign soil, but also beneath the shadow of questions that were never fully closed. Some are born and naturally accepted. Others must live their whole lives as though silently answering a trial without words. And if a person matures within such a feeling, it is understandable that later they would not wish to leave anything within the realm of ambiguity again. They would want to define, to classify, to fix, to carve all things into form. For whatever is not clearly named often stirs a very old unease. This perhaps was one of the most hidden origins of power. Power is not born only from ambition, but also from unease before the blurred and the uncertain. When a person is not sure from where they are being seen and judged, they may spend an entire lifetime compelling the world to see them exactly in the position they themselves have chosen. And in the age of Jing, the strongest way to do that was to stand so high that no one remained great enough to deny him. And so, if later he refused to remain within the old language, refused to be merely a king like the kings before him, if he wished instead to become the point of beginning for a new order, then perhaps that desire did not arise only from military victory. It also arose from a far deeper need to rewrite the origins of his own life through the scale of history itself. When people cannot wholly choose where they are born, they will sometimes strive to choose the way they are remembered by posterity. But before that dream could take shape, before the boy whose lineage was wrapped in many layers of mist could define himself through power, he was still only an adolescent, far too small before a throne far too large. Rank had arrived, but real power still rested in other hands. And within a court where youth carried less weight than jade seals, there was a boy about to learn the first cold lesson of kingship. To wear the crown did not yet mean to hold the fate of one's own life. Let the rhythm of the telling slow a little, slow like the sound of footsteps echoing across the cold stone floor of the Qin Palace, where every sound seems to travel farther than usual, then quietly dissolve into the long, shadowed corridors. There are moments in history that, at first glance, seem like the beginning of power, but in truth are only the beginning of loneliness. At the age of 13, Jing ascended the throne of Qin. To those looking from afar, it must have seemed a dazzling sight. A youth destined to stand at the summit, called king while still not yet beyond the tender years of early life. But if we look more closely, more slowly, we will see that the throne did not resemble a reward. It resembled a garment too heavy, draped across shoulders still growing, a step too high for feet not yet accustomed to standing firmly amid the winds of the court. In the world of rulers, rank arriving early does not mean fate is already in one's hands. On the contrary, sometimes it only means that a young life has been placed at the center of calculations it is not yet strong enough to unravel. Jing had the title of a king, but real power at that time still lay scattered in the hands of those older than he was, more seasoned than he was, and more accustomed to directing the currents of the age. The palace still held ceremonies for him, the ministers still bowed before him, but beneath those bows lay a very cold truth. The one seated on the throne was not necessarily the one deciding. It was a highly unusual circumstance and also a deeply important one for understanding the man he would later become. A boy who had grown up in foreign soil, already familiar with fragility and with being watched, was now placed in the highest position in form, though not yet in substance. Surely that was not a simple feeling of glory. It was perhaps more like standing atop a tower whose railings were all being held by other hands. From such a height, one might see very far, but not necessarily possess the right to descend by the path one wished to take. In those early years, the court of Qin still moved like a great carriage, whose reins did not yet rest fully in the hands of the young king. Around him stood faces rich in power, political experience layered as thickly as old dust upon bamboo slips, voices long accustomed to deciding all things. For a child, such a circumstance could easily produce one of two responses: either to accept becoming an obedient symbol in the hands of others, or to observe quietly, remember carefully, and wait for the day one would be strong enough to hold oneself secure. Ying seems to have belonged to the second kind. We do not know all that passed within the heart of that adolescent amid court audiences, consultations, and solemn rituals while real power still moved beyond his grasp. But later history reveals one thing: he was not the sort of person made to live long beneath the shadow of others. Perhaps those very years of sitting upon the throne without truly mastering it carved into him a lesson of great depth: that shared power is often only a graceful phrase for dependence, and that whoever does not truly hold the center will soon become merely an ornament of that very center. For many people, adolescence is the season in which they learn to trust. But for Ying, it may well have been the time when he learned caution. The palace that outsiders imagined as a place of shelter may, for him, have been a place where every word carried a second layer of meaning, where every gesture held something deeper beneath the surface. When one is still young and already made to sit amid such currents, innocence often fades very early. One begins to understand that some smiles are not truly meant for oneself. Some bows do not arise from loyalty, and some hands that steady the throne are also ready to turn it in another direction when the times begin to shift. And for that very reason, Ying's throne in those early years stood not only higher than his age, it stood higher even than the sense of safety a child ought to have known. He had to learn how to sit still in the highest place, without yet being able to fully speak in his own voice. He had to learn how to become the symbol of the state, while that very state was still being held in the hands of others. He had to live inside a great paradox, honored as king, yet not truly master of his own fate. Perhaps it was here, within that paradox, that another layer of Qin Shi Huang's character began to crystallize. Not only the longing to unify all under heaven, but also the longing to leave no gap whatsoever between title and actual power. Later, when he became relentless in matters of power, when he wanted all commands to proceed from a single center, perhaps this was not merely the ambition of an emperor. Perhaps it was also the deep response of a man who had once known what it meant to sit in the highest position, and yet not truly be in command. Seen from afar, the moment of ascending the throne is often treated as a sunrise. But for Ying, it was also the hour when the shadows began to show themselves more clearly upon the wall. the shadows of patrons, the shadows of old obligations, the shadows of power are being borrowed more than possessed. And among those shadows, one stood especially large. At once the one who opened the way, the one who covered him, the hand that lifted him, and the limit the young king would one day have to cross if he truly wished to become himself. For in a chamber of power, the hardest thing is not to enter. The hardest thing is to come to the moment of looking directly at the one standing nearer to the throne than oneself, and to understand that one day only one of the two can be the true center of that room. Let the breath slow by another measure, slow like the oil lamp in the Qin palace burning lower, making the shadows on the walls suddenly longer, deeper, and harder to distinguish, whether they are the shapes of human beings or the shapes of power. In his early years upon the throne, Yingzheng was not yet truly alone in the great chamber of fate. Beside him, there was almost always a shadow, both supporting and overshadowing him, both opening the way and blocking it. Lu Buwei. History often remembers Lu Buwei as an extraordinary merchant, a man able to see, in the chaotic current of the warring states' age, not only danger, but opportunity. He did not wield a famous sword like the great generals, nor did he wear royal robes and step directly onto the throne. But he understood a kind of strength more enduring than gold or jade, the strength of arrangement. He knew how to move a person from obscurity into the center of politics. He knew how to turn favor into a network, how to turn relationships into ladders. And he understood that in an age of disorder, whoever could orchestrate human beings could touch the core of power, even without directly wearing the crown. For Yingzheng, Lu Buwei was not merely a great minister. He had once been called Chancellor-Father, a title that carried both respect and dependence, as though what stood between them was not only the bond between ruler and subject, but also the bond between an adolescent not yet fully grown and a man long accustomed to standing at the center of every calculation. That title itself bore a special weight. For when a king must still call another man by a name so close to fatherhood, it also means that power at court has not yet been gathered beneath a single sun. But it was precisely here that a silent collision began to grow. Lu Buwei was a deeply characteristic product of the old age, an age in which power did not have to be perfectly straight, perfectly rigid, or perfectly directed from a single center. He was accustomed to a multi-layered way of governing, flexible when necessary, compromising when useful, weaving interests together to preserve a balance of forces. In that vision, ruling a state was like guiding a great carriage across uneven ground, not always forcing the wheels into a single straight line, but knowing how to lean with the terrain, how to loosen the reins at the right moment, how to allow different forces to coexist without overturning the entire carriage. Yingzheng, by contrast, a boy raised in foreign soil, in suspicion, in the feeling that the ground beneath his feet had never truly been firm, seems to have leaned toward a different longing altogether. He was not drawn to prolonged mixtures. He was not easily at peace with an order sustained by too many hands, too many voices, too many gray zones. For someone who had learned early that ambiguity could be the source of insecurity, a world more clearly defined, more rigid, and more centralized would always carry a stronger appeal. And so, the collision between them was not merely a conflict between two individuals. It was a collision between two ways of understanding the state. One side believed that power required networks. The other was gradually coming to believe that power required a center. One had matured in the art of maneuvering human beings. The other was growing into a need to place every human being in his proper place. One carried the flexible pragmatism of the warring states age. The other was quietly preparing for something greater, the ending of that very warring states age. Perhaps in Lu Buwei's eyes, Ying Zheng at first was still only a young king in need of guidance, a newly rising tree that still required the support of old bamboo stakes. But time sometimes does what even the strongest fail to notice. It teaches the hand once supported to begin slowly grasping itself. And when that happens, old debts of gratitude often grow heavy. The one who was once a support may become a limit. The shadow that once gave shade may begin to block the light. What was remarkable about Ying Zheng was that he was not the kind of person willing to live forever in a role arranged for him by others. Precisely because he had grown up amid doubt and dependence, he was even less able to endure the thought that his throne should remain too long propped up by the prestige of another man. A king may be grateful, but it is very difficult for him to live in peace when the entire court understands that there is someone nearer to the throne than the king himself when it comes to directing real power. And so, in silence, two currents began to flow in opposite directions. One current was the long-established influence of Lu Buwei, the old network, the old way of governing multi-layered power. The other was the will beginning to crystallize within Ying Zheng, the need for self-determination, centralization, and the gradual cutting away of the intermediate layers between the king and the fate of the state. This was not yet the moment when the sword left its sheath, not yet the moment when an order of dismissal or exile fell like thunder. At that time, everything still resembled a closed chamber where no one spoke too loudly, yet everyone could feel that the air had changed. Counsel had begun to grow heavier. The silences between the two men had begun to lengthen, and in the deepest chambers of the court, perhaps everyone understood. One day, Qin could no longer belong at once to both the Chancellor-Father and the young king. For those listening tonight, this is a moment worth pausing over in reflection, for history does not usually change when swords first appear. It changes course long before that, in rooms where two ways of thinking about order can no longer walk side by side. Lu Buwei represented the brilliance of an age of transition, but Ying Zheng, even while still very young, had already begun to long for something more decisive, not merely to steer the old carriage, but to recast the very mold from which the carriage had been made. And when a man has come to desire the power to recast that mold with his own hands, then every hand that once touched it, no matter how familiar, will sooner or later be regarded by him with increasing caution. Yet history did not hurry to open the door of rupture at once. Before the old shadow could truly be driven back, the Qin Palace still had to pass through a far more violent upheaval, a flame rising from the place that seemed most private of all, where the inner palace bloodline and seals of authority suddenly became entangled into a danger grave enough to force the young king, for the first time, to draw his own sword from its sheath. Let the breath move a little more slowly, slow like the last fire of the night, still smoldering in the brazier of the Qin Palace, not yet flaring high, yet enough to tell us that beneath the quiet ash, the heat has never truly disappeared. In the lives of rulers, there are upheavals that do not merely alter the balance of events, but alter the very people they become. For Ying Zheng, the upheaval named Lao Ai was such a flame. The first flame that made it impossible for the young king to go on living in the space between title and real power. After that fire, he did not merely put down a rebellion, he claimed himself. Laowai entered history from a place very near the privacy of the royal household, and precisely for that reason. The danger he created was more terrifying than that of an enemy on the battlefield. The schemes involving the Queen Mother, the privileges that exceeded his station, the influence that crept deep into the inner palace, and finally, the matter of forged, seals and troops nearly being mobilized. All of this made the crisis no longer the matter of one isolated man. It struck the softest place of royal authority, bloodline, legitimacy, and the power to issue commands in the king's name. In a court, undergoing the transfer of power, that was one of the most dangerous earthquakes possible. If before this, Yingzheng could still endure the condition in which the throne was his, while many of the levers still rested in other hands, now he had to face a colder truth. Even the nearest spaces around the throne could be penetrated, manipulated, and turned into weapons by others. A man who had grown up in suspicion, who had long been familiar with the feeling that the ground beneath his feet was never entirely firm, must have felt this crisis not merely as a political threat, but as the return of all his old unease in a more dangerous form. And so, his response was no longer that of a pressured adolescent. It was the response of someone who, for the first time, understood that if he did not seize the center with his own hands, someone else would seize it in his place. The suppression of Laowai's revolt, therefore, carried a meaning greater than the mere crushing of rebellion. It was the moment when the sword truly left the sheath in Yingzheng's hand. From this point onward, he was no longer the boy placed upon the throne, waiting for adults to arrange order around him. He became the one who began deciding for himself who might remain near power, who must be cut away, who could continue to live in the shadowed margins of the court, and who had to disappear so that a new order could begin to take shape. At a deeper level, this was also the moment when the last remnant of political childhood within him was burned away. Some people grow into adulthood gradually, like a tree rising season by season, until no one notices the day it has become tall enough to block the wind. But others come of age through a violent upheaval, and once that upheaval has passed, the person who existed before is gone. For Yingzheng, Laowai was that boundary. After it, he understood that power, if allowed to remain dispersed, would give birth to chaos. That blurred entanglements between the private and the political could shake the very foundations of a dynasty. And that trust, if not bound tightly by control, would always risk leaking into treason. It was a very harsh lesson, but the histories of empires are often built upon lessons just as harsh. Those listening tonight may feel that within this upheaval, there was not only the coldness of politics, but also a more hidden pain. For when a young king must strike at a danger that has arisen from the very place that should have been his most familiar shelter, the wound it leaves does not remain only in the affairs of the court. It also remains in the way he comes to see human beings. Once betrayal has emerged from the nearest place, it becomes very hard to believe that any greater distance could be safer. And perhaps it was from this point onward that, in Yingzheng's mind, the desire for control ceased to be merely a strategy of rule. It slowly became an instinct of survival. We may imagine the Qin Palace after that upheaval as a lake into which a great stone has just been thrown. The ripples spread very far. Shadows that once stood firm began to waver. old obligations suddenly became suspect. Bonds once thought durable began to reveal their cracks. And amid those widening circles, the young king began to see more clearly what he had perhaps sensed dimly for a long time. There could not be 2 or 3 centers in the world he wished to build. The crisis of Lullaby, therefore, did not end merely with the punishment of a rebel. It opened something much deeper, the process by which Ying purged the space around the throne, gradually narrowed the number of intermediary hands, and transformed the king from a symbol into the true center of power. After he had passed through that first great shock, he could no longer return to being the boy who once sat waiting within the network of others. And as so often happens in history, once a fire has burned once, it does not stop at the first door. It continues to lick at the deeper curtains within the great chamber of the court. After Lullaby, the man standing nearest the center could no longer keep his old place unchanged. The shadow of favor, of merit, of the role of Chancellor-Father that had once covered the early years of the reign now had to step back, little by little, from the light. The chamber of power became quieter, but also colder, emptier, and ready for a sun that would shine from only one direction. Let the rhythm of the telling settle a little more. Settle like a great chamber after the wind has just passed through, the curtains no longer trembling, the footsteps no longer hurried, leaving behind only a feeling difficult to name, as though something has just ended and something else is quietly beginning. After the Lullaby crisis, the court of Qin was no longer the same place. Some of the veils between the king and real power had been torn away. The ties once held together by habit, by gratitude, by the mutual reliance of a transitional era, now suddenly appeared in a colder light. And in that light, the name that could not but be reconsidered was Buwei. He had once been the one who opened the way. Once the hand that set the wheel of fate was turning in a direction many others could not yet see from far enough away. Once, the man who drew Yiren from obscurity closer to the throne. Once, the bridge crossed those uncertain years between the land of Zhao and the state of Qin. Without Buwei, the road that led Ying to the throne would surely have been different, or perhaps would never have taken shape in the way history came to witness. That made his presence in the early years of the reign both immense and complex. For there are achievements so great that when the time comes for them to depart, the shadow they leave behind is all the longer. But the history of power follows a quiet law. The one who helps build the center cannot be certain of living forever beside that center, especially when that center begins to develop its own will, its own pulse, and its own longing. After the first great shock of his reign, Ying was no longer the young king who merely sat, listened, and waited. He began to look around him with different eyes, no longer with the gaze of one being supported, but with the gaze of one who had to determine who truly belonged within the new order he wished to build. And in a world where he was coming more and more to believe that only absolute concentration of power could preserve lasting stability, Buwei, with his own network, his own prestige, his own influence, and the title of Chancellor-Father, once heavier than many words of praise, gradually became a presence no longer easy to reconcile. This was not merely a story of suspicion. It was the story of 2 ages touching within the same court. Buwei belonged to the world of transition, a world in which politics was the art of interweaving forces, preserving balance, allowing multiple centers to coexist within a structure not yet fully sealed. Yingzheng, by contrast, after all that childhood and those early years of kingship had taught him, wanted something entirely different. He wanted power no longer to have to pass through too many hands before becoming command. He wanted the center to be truly the center, not a summit supported by pillars, each possessing a will of its own. And so, Lu Buwei's departure from the center of power should not be understood merely as the fall from favor of a great minister. It resembled the moment when a dynasty began to alter the very structure of its own spine. Little by little, Yingzheng cut away the parts he believed belonged to the old order. Not hastily, like a storm striking everything down in a single night, but more slowly, more surely, more coldly, like a blacksmith placing the blade exactly where it must fall, then using only the force required to separate the mass of metal from the portion he no longer wishes to keep. Within that process, there was surely politics, calculation, and the king's own wariness toward a shadow once too large. But if we look more deeply into the spirit of deep sleep of power, we can also see another layer. This was also an act of separating himself from his political childhood. For Lu Buwei was not only a powerful minister, he was also the symbol of the period in which Yingzheng did not yet truly command his own fate. In pushing Lu Buwei farther and farther away from the light, Yingzheng was not only narrowing another network of power, he was erasing the crutch of his early years, so that from this point on, he would be forced to stand entirely upon his own feet. Even so, in every great severance, there is always a sorrow of a very particular kind. Lu Buwei was not a name that could be brushed away like dust from a sleeve. He was part of the road already traveled, part of the foundation, even if that very foundation later came to feel too narrow for the one standing upon it. And so, his departure from the stage carried a quiet after sound. In the world of power, gratitude may open the door, but it rarely has the strength to remain forever in the central chamber. Once a king has decided to become the sole source of light, every lamp that once helped him cross the darkness must, one by one, be extinguished. After Lu Buwei withdrew into the distance, the court of Qin became quieter in a certain sense. One great voice less. One long-standing network less. One old hand less, once accustomed to touching the vital levers of rule. But that quiet was not the soft peace of a house neatly arranged. It was the stern silence of a chamber just cleared, in preparation for placing at its center something heavier, sharper, more clearly shaped. From this point on, Yingzheng was no longer merely the boy once placed upon the throne. He was beginning truly to become the center of Qin. And from here as well, his need for control was no longer only a response to immediate danger. It was slowly becoming an instinct of rule. Once a person has tasted the feeling of being surrounded by too many other hands, he rarely wishes to return to that condition. He wants the law to be clearer, the position to be clearer, and the command to be clearer. He wants the world to be less ambiguous, less dependent upon the human heart, less shaken by blurred relationships. But to transform that need into a real system, will alone was still not enough. A king may wish to gather power into a single point, but if he wants to preserve it, he must have a language to name that order, a doctrine to uphold it, a set of instruments cold enough, sharp enough, logical enough to turn a personal longing into the structure of an entire state. And then, just as the chamber of power had been cleared of some of its old shadows, another man would step inside, carrying not the shadow of gratitude, but the ideological map of an empire not yet born. Let the breath settle by one more measure, settle like the surface of a night lake, deep and still, after the great ripples have passed, so that what remains is no longer sound, but the shape of the sky gradually appearing upon the quiet water. After the old hands had, one by one, withdrawn from the center of power, Yingzheng had begun to stand more alone within the court of Qin. But to stand alone has never been enough to build an empire. A man may possess an iron will, may carry within himself a profound fear of chaos, may long to gather all the broken fragments under heaven into a single whole. But to transform that longing into something more enduring than one human life, he needed more than strength of character. He needed a language for order, a map for power, a framework of thought rigid enough to support an entire realm moving toward unification. And it was precisely at that moment that Li Si entered. History remembers Li Si as one of the greatest minds to help shape Qin at its decisive hour. But if we tell the story more slowly, more gently, we may imagine him not merely as a great minister or a brilliant strategist. He was like the man who brought Yingzheng the measuring rule that the king had long been searching for, the rule by which to measure the world anew, to draw out the pathways of power, to turn private unease into a common system for an entire empire. Li Si came from the state of Chu, had studied under Junzi, and lived in an atmosphere where the great schools of thought of the warring states age competed with one another to explain how order might be saved from collapse. In such an age, people could choose many roads: to transform men through virtue, to harmonize society through ritual, to win hearts through benevolence. But Li Si, like many men of Qin, seems to have seen the world through colder eyes. He did not believe that a fractured realm could be mended by moral counsel alone. He understood that when the feudal states were all struggling to survive, when human loyalties shifted according to interest, when war had become the daily breath of history, a state that wished to become strong required a framework firmer than emotion. It is here that legalism appears. To tonight's audience, perhaps, legalism sounds like a concept, easily felt as dry, easily felt as hard. But if we look at it through a closer image, we may see that legalism is like an iron frame forged for a house being built amid fierce winds. When the wind is too strong, one cannot keep the house standing merely by hanging beautiful curtains or speaking gentle words. One needs pillars, beams, joints, and lines of support that are clear and load-bearing. Legalism was precisely the effort to create those lines of support for the state. In Li Si's hands, the familiar principles of legalism gradually became highly concrete tools for Yingzheng. Fa, law that is clear, uniformly applied, so that the realm is no longer dragged along by the arbitrariness of private feeling. She, the authority of position, the weight of the throne, so that power does not dissolve into the hands of those who stand around it. Shu, the art of governance, of control, of employing men, of reward and punishment, so that the machinery of state does not merely exist, but operates according to the will of the center. Those three words may sound cold and severe at first hearing, yet they were in truth exactly the language Yingzheng needed most. From a very early age, he had lived in a world where ambiguity always carried unease behind it. Ambiguity about his lineage, ambiguity about his place, ambiguity about who truly held power. And then growing up, through upheavals such as Lullaby, beneath the shadow of Buwei, he had even greater reason to believe that if the state were not built upon law and control, It would fall once more into the whirlpool of overlapping relationships, blurred authorities, and competing centers. It may be said that if Ying carried within himself the desire for unification like a flame, then Li Si was the man who helped that flame find the furnace in which it could be turned into steel. This is an essential point for understanding Qin Shi Huang as more than merely a conqueror. He was also a man who wished to reorganize the world. And to reorganize the world, victory by sword and spear was only the first step. After victory, there had to be law. After law, there had to be an administrative machine. After that machine, there had to be a body of thought strong enough to make every distant place move to the same rhythm. Li Si was the one who gave Ying that rhythm. Of course, hidden within it was also a colder side that later generations would have reason to reflect upon. Every iron frame holds two possibilities. It may help the house stand firm, but it may also make the house feel suffocating if one forgets the windows and the light. Legalism helped Qin grow stronger, more efficient, and less vulnerable to internal fragmentation. But precisely because it placed such value upon uniformity, discipline, and central authority, it also carried within itself the seed of a world in which the human heart would be forced to yield much space to prescribed form. Yet at this point in the story, what stands out most clearly is still the special meeting between a king determined to gather all under heaven and a mind that knew how to turn that longing into structure. From this point onward, Ying no longer possessed only will. He now possessed doctrine. He now possessed language. He now possessed the tools to see the whole of China, not as an endless field of chaos, but as a vast chessboard that could, step by step, be drawn beneath a single order. And when a man holds in his hands both longing and an intellectual map, his gaze will no longer remain fixed for very long within one palace or one narrow frontier. It will turn outward, farther, wider, toward the feudal states, still standing apart upon the fractured map of the warring states' age. In silence, a great chessboard was being laid out, and at one end of that board stood a man beginning to look upon each land as a fragment that first had to be broken away and then compelled back into a single form. Let the breath slow by one more measure, slow like a hand placing a game piece upon a wooden board in the middle of the night. Not hurried, not forceful, yet precise enough to alter the entire configuration before those outside have even realized it. After gradually gathering power into his own hands, after securing a framework of thought rigid enough to bear the weight of vast ambition, Ying began to look upon all under heaven no longer as a chain of separate threats. Before his eyes, China in the warring states' age appeared as a chessboard as broad as history itself, each feudal state a piece with its own temperament, its own interests, its own fears, and its own weaknesses. To prevail upon such a board, courage alone was not enough. One had to know how to wait. One had to know how to endure. One had to know when to use gold, when to use promises, when to use spies, and when at last to use the sword. It is here that the strategy of allying with distant states while attacking nearby ones reveals its cold and sharpened brilliance. At first hearing, those 4 words seem simple. Make alliances with the distant, strike at the near. But hidden within them is an entire way of seeing power. It is not merely a military tactic. It is the art of breaking the opponent's world into smaller pieces so that they cannot rise against you all at once. The distant states are soothed with promises, gifts, and temporary peace. The nearby states, because they lie pressed against Qin's borders, become the first targets to be peeled away. In this way, an invisible tightening circle begins gradually to close around the map of China. What is striking is how perfectly this strategy suited Ying Zheng's cast of mind, for he was not the sort of man who merely hungered for swift victory. Beneath his decisiveness lay a patience almost terrifying, the patience of someone willing to wait many years for a result from which there would be no turning back. Those who grow up amid insecurity often understand that haste is a gift offered to error. To gather all under heaven, one must know how to endure silences, detours, and stretches of road where victory has not yet arrived, yet the direction of the board has already begun to change. Perhaps in those years, Ying Zheng sat many times before the map, as another man might stare at a crack in a ceramic surface. He did not see the 6 remaining states merely as 6 enemies. He saw in them an old order fractured for far too long, a configuration in which each state survived not only by its own strength, but by the fragile balance among all the others. To break that configuration, one could not simply strike straight into the center. One had to deprive each fragment of its support, to hollow out alliances from within, to make each enemy feel itself increasingly isolated before realizing, too late, what had already happened. And so, in Ying Zheng's vision, war did not begin on the battlefield. It began at the negotiating table, with diplomatic missions, with gold and silver quietly flowing to the places where they were most needed, with words of counsel that allowed suspicion to seep into rival courts, with counterintelligence, division, bribery, and moments of hesitation created at exactly the right time. It was a style of power deeply characteristic of Qin, not romantic, not dazzling, but effective like cold water, steadily running into cracks in stone, until one day the entire rock must split apart. Within this lies a very deep historical lesson. Many imagine that empires are built chiefly through great battles. But in truth, empires are often built through the ability to read the moment, to know when the enemy is weakest, when their allies are most weary, when suspicion within their hearts has grown greater than loyalty, and when a single blow will not only wound them, but send tremors through the whole system around them. Ying Zheng seems to have understood this with remarkable clarity. He did not merely want to defeat each state in turn. He wanted to make the entire board gradually lose its ability to rearrange itself against him, and for that reason, allying with distant states while attacking nearby ones was also an expression of another of his qualities, the patience of a man who was not thinking only of today. While many rulers desired glories bright and immediate, Ying Zheng accepted a colder road, a longer road, a road less dazzling, yet capable of leading to the greatest outcome of all, bringing the whole realm beneath a single center. Tonight, as we listen to this story, we may feel more clearly why Ying Zheng differed from so many of his contemporaries. He was not merely a king, eager for victory. He was a man who wished to change the shape of the map itself, and whoever wishes to change the shape of the map must know how to see beyond individual battles. He must understand that an alliance made today may exist only to open the door to a conquest many years later. That temporary restraint may itself be the way to spare blood for a greater victory. That silence in the present is not always weakness, but may instead be the waiting for every piece to arrive in exactly the position one desires. But every great chessboard must eventually come to the moment when the first piece is knocked down, after many years of calculation, division, and waiting for the proper hour. the first gate of the central plain began to tremble. One state would collapse as swiftly as a door bolt suddenly thrown aside, and another would summon the return of the past. For that land was not only an enemy upon the map, but also a region of old memory, of a childhood once treated with scorn, of a boy who had grown up beneath unfamiliar eyes. And when that hour came, war would no longer be war alone. It would become a meeting between power and an old wound. Let the rhythm of the telling slow a little. Slow like an old city gate opening on a winter morning, its hinges sounding only very faintly. Yet that sound is enough to tell us that from this moment on, history will no longer travel along its old road. After long years of arranging the board, patiently allying with distant states, and wearing down those nearby, Yingzheng at last came to the moment when every calculation had to become action. The chessboard of all under heaven could not remain forever upon the table. There would come a time when the first piece had to be lifted from its place, and the first gate had to open for the armies of Qin to press deep into the heart of the central plain. That gate was the state of Han. Among the 7 great states of the Warring States period, Han was not the mightiest opponent. Its territory was not vast, its power was not deep, and its capacity to withstand pressure had already been worn thin by the weight of the times. And so, when Qin turned its spear point toward Han, history unfolded with an almost cold inevitability. Han fell quickly, like a door bolt long weakened after many seasons of strong wind, waiting only for the right push to give way. Yet that very swiftness carried immense meaning. It proved that Yingzheng's strategy no longer existed only on paper. It had begun to bite into reality. It told all under heaven that Qin did not merely wish to exert pressure upon the old order. Qin intended to replace that entire order with another. The fall of Han, therefore, was like the first crack appearing across a great mirror. Once that crack had shown itself, the other fractures would rarely remain far behind. For Yingzheng, it was proof that all under heaven could be gathered piece by piece, that what had once seemed enduring was only the outer shell of an order already too weary to hold, and that the divided age had begun to lose its power to protect itself. But if Han was a gate opened by strategic logic, then Zhao was a gate opened by something far deeper: memory. Zhao was not only a feudal state on the map. For Yingzheng, it was also the land of Handan, the place where his childhood had passed in estrangement, in the feeling of not belonging, beneath scrutinizing eyes and within the fragility of a child living on foreign soil. And because of that, the campaign against Zhao was not simply the next step on the road to unification. It also resembled the return of the past, though this time not in the form of a small and vulnerable boy whose fate was determined by others. This time, the one returning was the man who held in his hands the fate of an entire war machine. That is a psychological layer worth pausing to hear. In a human life, there are places we leave and imagine we have left behind. But in truth, they remain within us, like a grain of sand lying quietly in the fold of a robe. Small, yet carried all along the road. Handan was perhaps such a place for Yingzheng, the place where he had once been weak, once regarded through the eyes reserved for an outsider, once learned too early that the world was not as open as its outward appearance suggested. And for that very reason, when Zhao became the object of conquest, history suddenly took on another pulse, the pulse of an old wound being touched by the hand of power. We should not imagine this in an overly fiery or simplistic way, as though it were merely a personal revenge. Ying was too large a figure to act only from a passing emotion. But human beings, no matter how high they rise, rarely become wholly severed from the lands that once marked their childhood. Perhaps within his determination toward Zhao, beyond strategy, beyond interest, beyond the greater design, there also flowed something quieter, the longing to return to the place where he had once been looked down upon, not in order to lament the past, but to rewrite with his own hand the balance between himself and that place. War against Zhao, therefore, carried a weightier, deeper tone. This was no longer simply the defeat of another rival. It was a collision between the king of the present and the child of long ago, between the man who could command tens of thousands of soldiers to march, and the memory of the boy who had once lived beneath the shadows of another state's walls. As Zhao was gradually broken, what was subdued was not only a feudal state. A part of Yingzheng's own childhood seemed also to be pressed into silence. Seen more broadly, Han and Zhao were two immensely important beats in the work of unification. Han showed that the first gate of the Central Plain could indeed be forced open. Zhao showed that even lands bearing both strategic importance and the weight of memory could not remain outside the current Qin was now creating. One gate opened by the pressure of strategic configuration. The other was opened by the combined force of strategy and inward resolve. Together, they signaled that the process of unification was no longer a distant possibility. It had become a process whose footsteps could already be clearly heard. For tonight's audience, this is also the moment when we see more clearly one of Yingzheng's defining qualities. He did not allow emotion to divert him from the greater design, yet neither was he a block of stone without memory. He knew how to use the greater design to move through the deepest emotional regions within himself. And perhaps that is precisely what made him such a formidable architect. The farther he advanced toward unification, the fewer unresolved ambiguities he left behind. He wanted to close every gate, every crack, every broken fragment, until all under heaven remained only a single form. But the deeper he advanced into the heart of the Central Plain, the shorter the distance between himself and danger became. For the higher power rises, the more reckless become those who wish to strike at its heart. And in a palace where maps could be rolled up by hand, there would come a moment when such a map would be opened before the king. And from among the lines that seemed only to mark the land, a cold blade would suddenly flash forth, making all of history seem to hold its breath for one brief instant. Let the breath slow. Slow like the moment a map is unrolled upon the cold floor of the great hall, the edge of the silk lightly touching the wooden surface, everything seeming perfectly ordinary, until history suddenly flashes like a blade of steel beneath the lamplight. There are moments in the life of a ruler when all under heaven seems to hold its breath with him. Not out on the battlefield, amid the sound of chariots and the cries of battle, but in the very place that seems most strictly guarded of all, the great hall itself. And for Yingzheng, the moment when Jing entered the Qin court was such a wound. Brief, yes, but enough to reveal a truth that all great power must one day confront. The higher one stands, the nearer death stands beside him. Jing came from the state of Yan, bearing tribute, bearing a diplomatic pretext, bearing a carefully rolled map, just like so many formal gestures exchanged among the feudal states. Outwardly, it was a familiar scene of the warring states age. An envoy passing through the palace gates, head bowed low, hands offering tokens of trust, while those in power sat in higher places and observed in silence. But history, like human beings, sometimes hides the greatest danger in its thinnest layer of cloth. When the map was opened, the dagger opened with it, and within a single heartbeat, the Great Hall was no longer a place of ritual, but a place where death came very near to royal power. This is a scene of extraordinary cinematic force, but what matters most is not only its drama. More important still is the spiritual meaning it left behind. For Ying Zheng, this was not merely a failed assassination. It was a cold reminder that even after the fall of Han, even after the breaking of Zhao, even after many feudal states had begun to tremble before the strength of Qin, he had not entered a safer world. On the contrary, the closer he moved toward unification, the more he became the target of the desperation, resentment, and fear of those who knew they were about to lose everything. Perhaps this is the saddest paradox of power. People often imagine that the higher one rises, the more secure one becomes. But in truth, the higher one rises, the lonelier one becomes, and loneliness often walks hand in hand with fragility. When a king is still small, his death may shake only a single court. But when a man has become the axis of an entire historical process, his death may delay, distort, or shatter a vast project already shaping the fate of millions. And so, from the viewpoint of the states being driven into a corner, killing Ying Zheng was not merely the killing of one man. It was an attempt to sever the very arm that was gathering all under heaven into a single whole. And for Ying Zheng, that moment must also have done something else. It must have driven the suspicion already living within him deeper, harder, and more reasonable in his own mind. We should remember that this was not a man raised in peace. He was born amid war, spent his childhood on foreign soil, lived beneath the mist of uncertain lineage, endured early years of rule filled with intermediary hands, and then the Lullaby affair taught him that danger could rise from the very place closest to home. And now, even in the Great Hall itself, beneath the outer form of diplomacy, a blade could still come straight at him. For a man shaped by such a life, how could he still believe that the world would naturally soften if he softened? How could he not believe more and more that only absolute control could stop danger before it had time to take form? And so, Jingke's blade, though it failed to kill Ying Zheng, still carved a deep line into history. It made even clearer the cold truth that he had perhaps already felt for a long time. All under heaven can be truly quiet, only when every threat has been strangled before it can fully emerge. Another man might have drawn from that event a lesson about the human heart, about the tragedy of war, about the desperation of the defeated. But Ying Zheng seems to have drawn a different lesson. The enemy must never again be left enough breath to make one more desperate strike. Here, too, we may see Jingke as a symbol of a dying age. The state of Yan, like many other feudal states, had few roads left open to it. When the old order can no longer protect itself, it often gives birth to acts that are fierce, solitary, and bright with desperation, like the final spark before extinction. Jingke was thus a figure both terrifying and sorrowful. He came to the Qin Hall not because victory was certain, but perhaps precisely because he understood that ordinary hope had run dry. In his figure, there was loyalty, courage, and also the sorrow of forces that knew they were being driven backward by the wheel of history, yet still wished to preserve something with the offering of their own life. But that wheel did not stop. After the moment when the blade flashed and failed, Ying Zheng did not soften. He hardened. He did not hesitate. but gained even greater reason to accelerate. If before this unification had been the grand objective of a king steadily widening the board, then after this event, unification also became a matter of urgency. The remaining gaps had to be closed quickly. The sources of resistance had to be extinguished early, and all under heaven had to be stripped of any place independent enough to nurture yet another dagger hidden in a map. And so, after that blade in the Qin Hall, history seemed to move into a colder rhythm. The remaining fragments of the Warring States age were called forth, one by one. Some states would fall because they were too weak. Some would resist fiercely, only to sink at last into silence. Some campaigns would teach the lesson of haste. Others would prove the value of patience. And little by little, the shattered mirror of China would lose its scattered pieces, until the old sun of an age finally set, not with noise, but like a field of light, slowly withdrawing from the horizon, leaving behind a realm being forced to learn how to breathe in a single rhythm. Let the rhythm of your breathing slow a little, slow like the evening light gradually withdrawing from ancient fortress walls, when the sound of hoofbeats has already passed, yet their echo still lingers upon the earth, as though history itself also needs a moment of stillness to look upon what has just closed. After Han and Zhao, after the moment when Jing Ke's blade flashed and went dark, Yingzheng's road to unification was no longer merely a foreboding. It had become a current so powerful that the final fragments of the Warring States age, whether large or small, whether resilient or cautious, were all drawn one by one in the same direction. Wei, Chu, Yan, and Qi. Those four names were not merely the four remaining feudal states. They were like the last four shards of an old mirror, each reflecting a different manner of resistance before the day it would fall into silence. Wei was one of the next gates to close. There had once been a time when that state was a formidable power, with a military tradition and a strategic position that could not be taken lightly. But by the time Qin had driven both its war machine and its administrative machine to a level of discipline far tighter than the rest of the realm, Wei too began to appear like a tree, already worn down by the winds of the age. The fall of Wei no longer caused the same shock as it might have in earlier years, for by now the configuration had changed. People were beginning to understand that the power of Qin lay not only in individual battles, but in its ability to make the defeat of its enemies seem almost inevitable. But if Wei was a continued step forward in the momentum of victory, then Chu was a greater, heavier, deeper test. Chu was not like the opponents who had already grown weary. Chu was vast, rich in resources, possessed of its own depth, its own character, and enough strength to force anyone seeking to swallow all under heaven to slow down and think carefully. In the story of Chu, history no longer tells only of Yingzheng's strength, but also of a very important lesson for Yingzheng himself. Even the man who wishes to unite all under heaven cannot force reality to bend to his will without paying a price. At first, haste led to error. Li Xin was entrusted with responsibility, yet with forces insufficient for the scale of the confrontation, and defeat arrived like a cold warning. This is a highly significant moment in Yingzheng's entire journey, for it shows that he was not a man who always triumphed by will alone. There were times when even he had to look directly at the limits of decisiveness, when it ran too far ahead of reality. And in that very place, we see another side of his talent emerge, the ability to step back one pace in order to preserve the greater design. Instead of stubbornly pushing the mistake further, Yingzheng listened to reality. turned instead to place his trust in Wang Jian, the older general, more seasoned and more cautious. Wang. Jian did not promise swift glory. He asked for sufficient troops, sufficient time, and sufficient preparation. He advanced like rising floodwater, slow but certain, without display, without impatience, yet in the end powerful enough to drown the enemy. The victory over Chu was therefore not only a military victory, it was also the triumph of patience over haste, of long vision over the restless desire to end everything quickly. This is a beautiful detail in the portrait of Yingzheng. People often remember him only as a symbol of iron will, yet in certain decisive moments, he also knew how to accept what reality required. Perhaps it was precisely because of this that his dream of unification did not break apart halfway through. The greater a man becomes, the more he must learn that pressing faster is not always the same as being stronger. Sometimes, true strength lies in knowing how to wait for the proper rhythm of history. After Chu came Yan, the state that had once sent Jing into the Qin Hall now no longer possessed the power to alter its own fate. If earlier Yan could still be remembered through that final desperate act of reckless courage, now its existence resembled only a small flame before a great wind. Qin moved forward no longer only in the posture of a conqueror, but like the pull of a new order, gradually draining away the living space of the old one. Yan receded, and with it, yet another part of the age of feudal states withdrew into shadow. And then at last came Qi. In many stories of unification, the final moment is not as thunderous as people imagine. It does not have to be a great blood-soaked battle that shakes heaven and earth. Sometimes, the end of an age arrives in a manner more weary, more silent, almost as though all have already understood that nothing can now be reversed. Qi, after standing and watching the tides of the age turn, after seeing one state after another fall, at last surrendered as well. And thus, the Warring States period came to a close. We may imagine the twilight of that age as the sun setting over a vast plain, where the old battle banners gradually shorten into shadow and then dissolve into the night. So many generations of feudal lords, alliances, betrayals, calculations, wars, hatreds, negotiations, all passed like a very long dream in the history of China. When Qi bowed its head, it was not only the final state that fell. An entire way in which the realm had existed also came to an end. From this point on, the map would no longer be the story of many centers struggling to hold one another in balance. It was preparing instead to learn how to breathe beneath a single center. For those listening tonight, this is a point well worth pausing over to feel the weight of what has just occurred. Yingzheng did not merely defeat one rival after another. He brought to an end a structure that had endured for centuries. He accomplished what not even the strongest victor in individual battles necessarily achieves. He turned military victory into the closing of an entire era. That is why his story is greater than the story of an ambitious king, hungry for conquest. It is the story of a man who pressed all under heaven into a moment of transformation. But once the final fragments had fallen silent, another question immediately arose. What would a man call himself after bringing an entire age to an end? A king of Qin, or a new title, greater than all the old language once used to name the rulers before him? For there are victories that do not end with the taking of land. They also demand the right to name anew the order that has just been born. And when that moment came, Yingzheng would not be content to remain within the old garments of history. He would clothe himself in a title that had never existed before, as though to tell posterity that from this point onward, not only had all under heaven changed, but even the language used to name power itself would have to begin again from the beginning. Let the breath slow a little, slow like the final moment of a very long afternoon, when the sun has sunk low, and the city walls, the chariot wheels, the banners that once flew through the dust and wind of so many years of conquest suddenly stand still in a thin and solemn light. That is often the moment when history does something very strange. After so much noise, it suddenly demands a name. When Han, Zhao, Wei, Chu, Yan, and Qi had one by one fallen into silence, Ying was no longer one king among many kings. He had come to stand in a place where no one else in all under heaven stood beside him. But at that very height, another question emerged. Perhaps deeper even than the question of victory. If the old order had come to an end, then what should the man standing at the center of the new order be called? The word king of the feudal age had now become too small. It belonged to an old world where states coexisted, competed, and each preserved its own center. It was the language of a map still divided. But Ying had just done what none of the kings before him had ever achieved. He had gathered all under heaven into one. If he continued to stand within the old garment of language, then even his victory would seem diminished, confined within the very limits he had just shattered. And so, he did something that very few people in history have dared to do. He gave a name to his own era. Huang and Di were words that carried ancient echoes, calling to mind sage rulers and figures half historical, half legendary from the earliest beginnings. By joining them together into Emperor, Ying did not merely create a new title. He created a new linguistic elevation for power itself. Then by adding the word first, he went farther still. He wished not only to be the strongest man of the present, but to be acknowledged as the point of beginning of an entirely new order within the long flow of history. This is a moment worth listening to very slowly. Many people think that ruling is, first of all, a matter of taking land, holding armies, issuing commands. But in truth, power has a deeper layer still, the right to define the world. The one who can name the new order does not rule only by sword and spear, but also by symbol. Ying understood this with remarkable clarity. After bringing the age of the feudal states to an end, he would not accept being named in the language born from that very age. He wanted to separate himself from the past, as though to say that from this point on, all under heaven had not merely changed masters. It had changed its very understanding of where its center lay. If we look more deeply into the psychology of the man, this moment also carries a distinctly DSP resonance. We remember the boy who grew up in the land of Zhao, amid doubts over his parentage, amid the feeling of never wholly belonging anywhere. We remember the adolescent who sat upon the throne, while real power still rested in the hands of others. We remember the young king who had to claim himself amid intrigues in the inner palace and shadows too large within the court. For such a man, giving himself a title that had never existed before was not merely a political act. On a very deep level, it was also an act of rewriting the origins of his own life. Those born in mist often long to create their own sun. Ying seems to have done exactly that. He did not allow others to name him according to the old mold. He stepped forward himself and established the position around which all other forms of address would now have to turn. It was an act at once full of majesty and full of loneliness. For when a man lifts himself into the position of being the beginning of an era, he also separates himself from all equality. From this point onward, he was no longer merely the king of Qin. He became the center of an all under heaven, newly redefined. And at the same time, the one who had to bear upon his shoulders the full weight of that definition. It is precisely here that we see one of Qin Shi Huang's great defining traits. He never wanted only to win on the surface. He wanted to win at a deeper level, the level of symbol, of ritual, of language, of the memory through which posterity would remember an age. He understood that an empire cannot endure if it rests only upon fear. It must also possess forms that make people feel that the world has truly turned a page. The title, First Emperor, was one such marker. It was like the sound of a bell after a storm, announcing that not only had the battle ended, but the whole house had been rebuilt according to another design. Of course, within that grandeur, there already lay the seed of harshness. For when a man names his own era, he is rarely willing to tolerate what still stands outside the mold he has just created. The greater the title, the stronger the need to make all under heaven conform to it. And Yingzheng, now the first emperor, would not stop at allowing the realm to know who he was. He also wanted the realm to operate according to the exact shape that such a title demanded. And so, after the new title, there had to come a new common mold. There could not be a first emperor while the realm still wrote in many scripts, measured by many systems, used many currencies, traveled on roads cut for different axle widths, and lived according to rhythms that remained fragmented. If he had named his own era, then that era also had to take on a concrete form in the daily life of human beings. From this point onward, power would no longer dwell only in the throne or the war chariot. It would enter the written script, the coin, the measuring rod, the wheel, the road joining distant lands into a single rhythm of breath. For there are some people who do not wish to be remembered only as victors. They wish to leave behind a mold. And once that mold begins to be pressed down across the whole realm, history will no longer speak only of an emperor who has just been named, but of the moment when a country begins to learn how to live within a single shared shape. Let the breath slow a little. Slow like the sound of wheels rolling steadily along a long earthen road after an old rain, where each turn seems so small, yet keeps repeating again and again, until the distance between faraway regions begins to grow shorter. After giving himself the title of a new era, Qin Shi Huang understood one thing very clearly. All under heaven could not truly become one if it were joined only by military victory. Swords and spears could open gates. Armies could seize land. But for a vast realm to live as a single body, more was needed than submission. It needed a common mold. It needed silent rules that entered daily life so deeply that people in distant places would still be living within the same rhythm, perhaps without even realizing it themselves. And that was when Qin Shi Huang's genius as a builder revealed itself most clearly. Many remember him as the man who unified the 6 states. But if we stop there, we still do not reach the deepest part of the legacy he left behind. What made him a figure whose shadow stretches even into the modern world was not merely the conquest of the map. What was greater lay here. He began to cast the first mold for a unified state in the administrative, commercial, communicative, and operational sense. He did not merely want the lands to bow before a single center. He wanted them to move in the same rhythm. Before Qin, all under heaven, though sharing many layers of Huaxia culture, still lived according to the separate habits of each feudal state. The written script had different forms. Currency was not uniform. Measures, units of weight and volume, the width of wagon axles, all could differ. This was not only a matter of technical variation, it meant that commands traveling far could easily become distorted, commerce traveling far could easily stumble, and a broad expanse of land could hardly function as a single whole. Each place still seemed to preserve part of its own rhythm from the age of division. Qin Shi Huang wanted to bring that to an end. First came writing. Perhaps nothing is more silent and yet more powerful than writing. Swords and spears may make people afraid for a season, but writing can allow a command to live across generations. By standardizing the script, the Qin court was not merely making things convenient for officials. They were creating a road by which the will of the center could travel very far without changing meaning along the way. A character written in the same form across many regions did not merely help people understand one another better. It helped the state become present everywhere through one common language. From this point onward, all under heaven was no longer joined only by conquered frontiers, but also by strokes of the brush sharing the same pattern. Then came currency. A common currency, in the end, is a very quiet yet very powerful declaration. Different lands are now being drawn into the same rhythm of exchange. Once currency was standardized, trade no longer had to struggle awkwardly between local systems of value. A person from afar could exchange goods with someone near the center without having to cross so many invisible barriers. The market began to learn how to breathe through a larger lung, and every small transaction in daily life, a good, a sack of grain, a bolt of cloth, quietly became proof that the country was being bound together by practical threads, not merely by emblems and rituals. After that came measurement. At first hearing, the unification of units of measure may sound dry and small, but in truth, it is one of the most foundational acts of any state that wishes to endure. For when each place measures in its own way, weighs in its own way, calculates in its own way, then fairness, control, and the efficiency of the whole apparatus all begin to leak away. Standardizing measurement is a way of bringing the material world into a common language. From how many grains of millet, how many spans of land, how many weights of iron, all things began to be drawn into an order that could be counted, managed, taxed, and distributed. In other words, this was the moment when power descended from the throne and touched the very concrete objects of daily human life. And then came roads and axle widths. This is a beautiful image through which to understand Qin Shi Huang's talent for construction. An empire cannot truly be one if the roads between its regions remain rough and shaped by separate standards that do not fit together. Once axle widths were standardized, once roads were planned so that vehicles could pass through many regions without stumbling over old technical differences, then all under heaven began to be joined not only in concept, but in actual movement. Goods could travel farther, soldiers could move faster, officials could arrive more precisely. News and commands were no longer delayed beyond measure by differences that had once seemed very small. From then on, the country itself seemed to grow shorter through the very roads that crossed it. That is what makes this part especially important, for it shows that Qin Shi Huang was not only the man who broke the old order, but the man who established the operating rhythm of the new one. He understood that a state does not endure through isolated victories. It endures through things repeated every day. The way a character is written, the way a coin is used, the way a good is weighed, the way a cart rolls along a road without being halted by the differences of one region from another. It is precisely these seemingly small things that create the greatest durability. They turn a broad land into a political space with a shared center, shared standards, and a shared rhythm of life. Of course, within that unification, there was already the faint outline of a colder edge. For every common mold, both builds and limits. When too many things are brought under a single standard, local diversity also begins to be forced backward. But at that moment, from Qin Shi Huang's point of view, what was more urgent than all else was to keep the realm from falling apart again. After centuries of war, he seems to have believed that order could endure only if it were unified enough to resist fracture from within. And it must be acknowledged that, in the very long historical sense, he laid down the first stones of a form that would endure long afterward. Modern China, if understood as a vast space shaped by an idea of central power, administrative standardization, infrastructure, and common communication, began to take its earliest form from those very decisions. This is why Qin Shi Huang's legacy reaches far beyond the span of one reign. He left behind not only victory, but a mold. But once a mold has been set down, it will need larger lines still to hold the body of the empire together. Beyond lay frontiers that had to keep out the northern sands and hoofbeats. Within lay waterways and roads that had to join distances that once seemed impossible to cover. And like a man never satisfied with smaller lines, Qin Shi Huang would go on to draw upon the body of the land two very great strokes, one to block, one to connect, majestic as the dream of empire, and sorrowful too, as a sigh mingled into stone, into mud, into the sweat of nameless human beings. Let the breath slow by one more measure, slow like the night wind passing across a distant mountainside, where stone has lain still for thousands of years, yet still keeps within it the sound of the footsteps of those who once passed there to build a dream greater than their own lives. When all under heaven had been gathered into one, Qin Shi Huang did not stop at establishing laws or standardizing writing, currency, and roads. For him, an empire needed more than a common mold within. It also needed a clear shape at its outer edges and firm arteries within. A vast country that wished to endure could not possess only a center. It had to have borders able to defend themselves, and it had to have roads, waterways, and works powerful enough to join distant regions into a continuous body. It was from that need that two great constructions appeared like two immense strokes drawn across the body of the new empire, the Great Wall and the Lingqu Canal. One line to block, one line to connect. Seen from a great distance, the Great Wall resembles a long thread stitching together the northern edge of all under heaven. It was not a wall raised out of empty air, but the linking, extension, and strengthening of older defensive walls that had already existed during the feudal age, now drawn out and reorganized under the will of a single center. For Qin Shi Huang, this meant more than simple defense. It was a declaration that the empire not only knew how to conquer, but also how to define its own boundaries against the threats of the north. In the ancient world, borders were not always the clear lines on a map that we are accustomed to imagining today. They were often zones of blurred contact between agriculture and nomadism, between stability and movement, between an empire seeking to settle order and the mounted peoples accustomed to the open rhythm of the steppe. For that reason, the Great Wall was not merely earthen ramparts, stone barriers, or military garrisons. It was the expression of a civilizational choice, the choice to build an outer edge for order, as though telling all under heaven that from this point onward, Within lay the land of law, fields, records, commands, and common standards. But like all great works in history, the majesty of the Great Wall has always stood beside a quiet sorrow. For stone does not pile itself upon stone. Earth does not raise itself into walls. Behind a long line of fortifications stand countless rough hands, exhausted footsteps, sweat, sickness, and often even lives swallowed by history into silence. When people hear of monumental works, they often remember the name of the one who gave the command. But beneath every layer of packed earth and every placed block of stone lie innumerable human beings whose names were never preserved. They are the silent underside of every imperial dream. The more power wishes to build something lasting, the more it often demands a heavy price from the labor of the people. That is what makes the story of Qin Shi Huang always carry two shades at once. On the one hand, one cannot help but be astonished by his vision. He understood that a newly unified country had to know how to defend its borders through construction and organization, and could not merely rely on the fading radiance of recent military victory. But on the other hand, it is precisely where those great works rose that we also hear the sigh of lives pressed down beneath an ambition too large for them. If the Great Wall was the line drawn to block, then the Lingqu Canal was the line drawn to connect. Less often remembered in popular memory, the Lingqu Canal is nevertheless a beautiful symbol of the organizational thinking of the Qin Empire. This work linked river systems, helping connect the north with the south, facilitating the transport of grain, troops, and supplies, and later broader movement within the country itself. If the Great Wall was the arm extended outward to brace the frontier, then the Lingqu Canal resembled a quiet blood vessel flowing through the body of the empire, carrying energy from one place to another, so that the whole body might live as a single organism. Here we see, even more clearly, that Qin Shi Huang's genius did not lie in conquest alone. He thought of the empire as a body with bones, arteries, flesh, an outer edge, and inner circulation. If that body was to endure, it was not enough merely to defeat enemies. It had to be connected. Distances had to be shortened through engineering, organization, and infrastructure. The Lingqu Canal, in that sense, was not merely a canal. It was the expression of a dream to bridge every distance, so that the will of the center, the armies of the center, and the goods of the center could travel farther, faster, and deeper into every region. Hearing this, we can understand why this part matters so deeply in the whole story. An empire does not live by its brightest moments of glory alone. It lives by its ability to keep distant regions bound together after the war drums have fallen silent. And with the Great Wall and the Lingqu Canal, Qin Shi Huang was doing precisely that. With one hand, defining the outer edge, with the other drawing the inner lands closer. One side kept the enemy outside the gate, the other preserved the vital flow within the house. But it is also here that his paradox becomes clearer than ever. The more a man wishes to bridge every distance, the more difficult it can become for him to tolerate differences that refuse to fit within a single mold. The more he wishes the empire to operate like a unified body, the more likely he is to want every voice within that body to beat in the same rhythm. And when such a way of thinking goes too far, the borders once meant to defend the realm gradually begin to move inward into the spiritual life of human beings themselves. Not only roads, rivers, and walls are standardized, but speech, thought, schools of learning, and the memory of all under heaven also begin to be regarded with increasing suspicion. And so, after these majestic constructions, history will step into the darker region of the dream of unification. There we will see a truth both profound and sorrowful. The more a man fears division, the more easily he comes to desire the erasure of difference. And when a state wishes not only to unify the land, but also to unify thought itself, then the fire once used to warm order can very easily become the fire that burns away many other voices. Let the breath slow a little more, slow like a fire in the night. At first glance it seems warm, yet if we draw too near, we begin to see that light and destruction are sometimes separated by only the thinnest breath of air. By this point in the story, Qin Shi Huang had achieved what so many generations before him could not. All under heaven had been unified: writing, currency, measurement, roads, borders, canals. All were gradually being brought under a single mold. Seen from a great distance, it was the image of a vast order, newly erected after many centuries of division. But history rarely allows human beings to keep the light without letting the shadow come with it. And with Qin Shi Huang, that shadow appeared most clearly at the moment when he began to want to unify not only the land, but thought itself. It was then that the dark side of the dream of absolute unity stepped into the light. Those who grow up in insecurity often long even more deeply for a world that can be controlled. In Jing, we have seen that from very early on: a childhood on foreign soil, a lineage veiled in mist, a throne not yet truly his, intrigues within the inner palace, a blade in the Qin Hall, fragments of the map always threatening to break apart. His whole life seems to have been a struggle against fragmentation, and precisely for that reason, once he had finally built an empire with a center, he became increasingly unable to accept whatever still stood outside the mold he had set down. At one level, that is a logic we can understand. A state that has only just emerged from an age of chaos is often deeply afraid that chaos may return. Different voices, contending schools of thought, different ways of remembering the past. Under the gaze of a man like Qin Shi Huang, these may no longer have appeared as signs of intellectual vitality. They may instead have appeared as latent cracks in the wall of unity that had only just been completed. And when a man has spent his entire life sealing such cracks, he can very easily arrive at a cold conclusion. If order is to endure, difference must be reduced. If the empire is not to fracture, all under heaven must have fewer voices. From there, history entered the dark chapter that posterity would long remember: the burning of books, the suppression of intellectual schools, and the story of the burying of scholars, which became a symbol of the harsh face of the Qin Empire. What is worth reflecting upon here is not only the act itself, but the psychology of power standing behind it. There are rulers who wish to be obeyed, but there are also rulers who want something deeper than that. They want the world to become simpler, so that they no longer have to fear what they cannot predict. Qin Shi Huang seems to have belonged to the latter kind. He did not only want people to obey commands, he wanted all under heaven to have fewer sources of memory that could compete with the center, fewer teachings that might lead people to look at power through another lens, and fewer scholarly traditions unwilling to fit themselves into the organizational mold he and Li Si had built. Seen in this way, we understand that this is not merely a story of brutality. It is the story of a very deep paradox. The more a man fears division, the more easily he comes to desire the erasure of difference. And once power has convinced itself that diversity is itself a danger, then what is first consumed by the flames is not the enemy's army, but the different possibilities of thought within one's own society. The burning of books, therefore, it did not merely burn bamboo slips and texts. It also burned the bridges connecting human beings to many different sources of memory. It was an effort to force the past to pass through a single gate before being allowed to enter the present. And that is always a sorrowful moment in the history of any civilization. For books are not merely words. Books are the places where generations leave behind the ways they understood the world, the ways they disagreed, the ways they questioned, the ways they sought a path through chaos. When books are burned because they do not fit a new order, what is lost is not only ink and bamboo. What is lost is the breadth of spiritual space itself. As for the story of the burying of scholars, however, later historical records may debate its scale, its details, and its precise accuracy, but it has endured for a very long time as a symbol. It symbolizes the moment when power is no longer satisfied with governing behavior, but seeks to intimidate the intellectual class, the speakers, the debaters, the keepers of standards different from those of the court. At the symbolic level, it is a declaration that the state does not merely wish to unify all under heaven through law and roads, but also to define the limits of legitimate speech. This is where the story of Qin Shi Huang becomes truly large in the DSP sense. For if we told his story only as that of the man who unified China, we would have only an epic. But upon reaching this point, the story opens into the depths of tragedy. We begin to understand that every vast project of power carries within itself a very ancient danger. The more successful it becomes in creating order, the more easily it forgets that human beings are not stone, not wheels, not units of measurement that can be completely standardized. Human beings live by memory, belief, schools of thought, tradition, dialogue, and difference. When power seeks to reduce all of these to a single mold, it may create stability in the short term, yet at the same time, it plants in the heart of history a very long fear. Perhaps that is why, when we look back upon Qin Shi Huang, we must both acknowledge his magnitude and preserve within ourselves a moment of stillness so that admiration does not become blindness. He helped bring into being the form of a nation. That is truly great. But he also showed the price human beings may have to pay when the dream of unity goes too far, so far that it leaves no room for difference to breathe. And then, as so often happens in history, after a man has sought to unify land, law, roads, writing, borders, and even voices themselves, he soon comes upon one final territory that refuses to submit. It is no longer the world outside him. It is time. It is death. It is the finitude of his own body. For there are people who conquer everything beyond their reach, only then to begin trembling before what lies within the very current of their own life. And as the night of power deepens, we will see the emperor who once sought to cast the whole world into a single mold, now drawn into another search, more fragile, more desperate and sadder than any conquest before it. The search for an elixir that might keep him alive forever, when all under heaven has fallen silent, yet the human heart still cannot grow still before the shadow of death. Let the breath slow a little more, slow like the lamp in the night being turned down by one more notch, enough for us still to see the face of history, yet gentle enough that the sorrow in this story may come nearer without causing the heart to startle. Perhaps there is no paradox in the life of Qin Shi Huang deeper than this one, the man who gathered the broken fragments of all under heaven into a single whole, the man who cast the mold for writing, currency, measurement, roads and borders, the man who made the feudal states fall silent one by one. In the end, still had to stand before something no command could ever reach. That was a time. That was death. People often think that when a man stands at the summit of power, what he fears most is being overthrown. But very often, once all outward rivals have been subdued, the greatest fear finally reveals itself in its most primal form. The fear that this body will one day decay, that this breath will one day cease, and that everything one has just built will continue onward without needing one's presence there. For Qin Shi Huang, that fear was perhaps especially fierce, for he was not a ruler who merely wished to enjoy the throne in the present moment. From the time he proclaimed himself the first emperor, he had already sought to place himself at the point of beginning for an order that would continue across many generations. In that dream, power was not only a matter of today. It was a declaration made to time itself. It was an effort to stamp his presence upon centuries yet to come. But the more a person thinks about what may endure for a long time, the harder it becomes to bear the thought that he himself is finite. The more he longs for the empire to endure, the more deeply he may be haunted by personal death. For an empire may be dreamed of as lasting for 10,000 generations, while a human life remains only a few fragile decades. And so, after conquering nearly everything that could be conquered by armies and institutions, Qin Shi Huang began to enter another search, a search that history has always recounted in a tone at once enchanted and sorrowful, the search for the elixir of immortality. In the final years of his life, he made repeated inspection tours throughout the empire. On the surface, these were journeys to survey all under heaven, to affirm the authority of the center before distant lands. But at a deeper level, those journeys seem also to have carried another rhythm, the rhythm of a man unwilling to remain still before his own finitude. He sought out Fangxi, listened to promises of immortal medicines, of divine islands, of lands where death had not yet laid its hand. Like so many great wielders of power in history, once he had gathered too many things into his grasp, he began to turn his longing toward the one thing that always remains beyond the grasp of every human being: more time. This was not merely superstition or delusion in any simple sense. If we look at it through the lens of deep sleep of power, we can see here a very human loneliness. For in the end, no matter what name all under heaven gave him, no matter how vast his empire, no matter how many miles his voice could travel, his body was still the body of a human being of flesh and bone. It still aged in silence. It still grew weary with each passing season. It still could not carry its own law the way a dynasty might. Perhaps that is the most painful thing for all those who have grown accustomed to giving commands to the world. In the end, they cannot command the beating of their own heart. History also leaves behind details at once strange and tragic. The elixirs presented by the Fangxi, substances believed capable of prolonging life, may in fact have contained mercury, a slow poison quietly damaging the very body it promised to save. That is a paradox, almost symbolic in nature. The man who wished to live forever, in his struggle against death, may have unknowingly stepped closer toward it, as though history wished to whisper something very cold. There are doors that do not open by force of will, and the harder one tries to force them open with power, the more one may wound oneself. Then at last, death came at Shaqiyu, not in a great hall radiant with victory, not amid the acclamations of a newly unified empire, but upon the road during one of his tours, while the journey was still ongoing, as though history deliberately chose an in-between moment to remind us that human life is never fully able to catch up with its own designs. The death of Qin Shi Huang, like many great endings in history, carries an air both majestic and desolate. After all, the man who wished to transmit his dynasty through 10,000 generations still could not prolong his own life for very much longer. And then comes the detail that posterity has long remembered like a cold mist settling over the final scene, to conceal the fact that the emperor had died. The entourage had carts of fresh fish carried alongside in order to mask the smell of the decaying body. That is a deeply DSP image. On one side stands the first emperor of a unified China, the man who made all under heaven change shape. On the other side is the smell of fresh fish on carts, moving through dusty sunlight, used to conceal the truth that this body, too, was returning to the oldest law of all living things. Power, in the end, still could not triumph over the smell of death. And perhaps it is precisely because that contrast is so stark that this ending feels so sorrowful. It does not mock him. It only reminds us that every great dream of humankind, no matter how magnificent, must still pass through the narrow gate of finitude. Yet it would be too simple to close the story there, as merely a lesson in personal failure. For although Qin Shi Huang did not live as long as he had wished, what he built did not die with him. The Qin Empire collapsed rather quickly after his death. That is true, but the mold he laid down for the idea of a unified China, with a center of power, with common standards, with the ambition to join distant regions into a single political space, lived far longer than his body did. In a very deep sense, he did not defeat the death of his own life, but he still left behind a political form strong enough to continue moving through the centuries that followed. And that is perhaps what makes this story so quiet and yet so penetrating. The man who conquered all under heaven in the end still lost before time. But within that defeat before time, he left his imprint upon something that lasted longer than a single human life. There are people who cannot live forever in the way they wish, yet they continue to live in another way, in the roads, the laws, the borders, the memory, and the idea of a nation within which posterity continues to walk. The night is deepening, and now that the story has almost completed its circle, history suddenly softens its voice, like an old man sitting by a window and gazing far out across many seasons of rain and sunlight. From 221 BCE to the world of 2026, many dynasties have risen and fallen, but the idea of a unified China, with a center, with an administrative mold, with common standards of operation, still remains like a long line, not easily erased. And so, before the lamp goes fully dark, perhaps we should ask the final question, no longer for Qin Shi Huang alone, but for our own age. What lessons does a nation born from such immense power leave for the year 2026 about state building, about the cost of unity, and about the final limit before which all power must bow? Let the breath slow a little, slow like the lamp in the room being turned down by one more notch, bright enough that we can still see the path, yet gentle enough that the heart does not have to remain awake too long with the noise of the world. Breathe in, as though inviting peace to enter. Breathe out, as though gently seeing the weariness of a long day out through the door, light as a thin layer of dust, leaving the surface of old wood beneath the passing of a hand. And now, as the story of Qin Shi Huang has nearly completed its circle, we return to the year 2026, our own age, an age full of light, yet not always warm enough, full of connection, yet also full of invisible divisions, full of voices, yet not always of the same rhythm of listening. News travels faster than reflection. Judgment arrives sooner than understanding, and within that current, the story of the man who lived more than 2,000 years ago still leaves behind a very long resonance. A nation is not born through victories on the battlefield alone, but through the ability to turn those victories into the enduring form of everyday life. That is perhaps the first lesson Qin Shi Huang leaves to the year 2026. People often remember him through the image of a conqueror, the man who subdued the 6 feudal states one by one and brought the warring states period to an end. But if we remember him only in that way, we see only the noisiest part of the story and miss the most enduring part. For what made his imprint stretch across so many dynasties was not merely that he won. What was greater lay in the fact that he understood that a country wishing to endure must have laws, infrastructure, standards, and a center strong enough to allow lands very far from one another to function like a single body. Writing was standardized so that commands would not change form along the road. Currency and measurement were unified so that commerce could share a common language. Roads, canals, and borders were reorganized so that power would not dwell only upon the throne, but would flow into the smallest movements of society itself. To put it more gently, Qin Shi Huang understood something that every modern age must still learn again. A nation is not only a map, a nation is a shared rhythm of operation. A vast land does not become a country simply because it shares one color on a map. It becomes a country when people living across great distances begin to live within forms of operation through which they can recognize one another, trust one another, and move forward together. That is why, from 221 BCE to 2026, so many dynasties have risen and receded, yet the idea of a unified China, with a center of power, with a common administrative structure, with shared standards for language, commerce, infrastructure, and borders, still bears the very clear imprint of its founding in Qin Shi Huang. But history, as we have walked through it together tonight, never offers its lessons through the light alone. His second lesson lies in the cost of unity. For every great project of power carries within it a very deep temptation. Once it has created order, it easily begins to want to extend that order into every place, every person, every voice. And when the fear of division grows too great, power very easily begins to see difference itself as a danger. It is there that Qin Shi Huang's darker side appears. In severity, in the burning of books, in the suppression of what was seen as disturbing the form of the empire. This makes his story not only a song of construction, but also a quiet warning to the present. A nation may grow strong through unity, but if unity goes too far, it can also crush diversity and impoverish the spiritual life of that very people. This is a lesson well worth the people of 2026 reflecting upon, for our own age also lives between two needs that seem opposed, yet are both necessary: the need for shared order and the need to remain different without being erased. Without order, society easily breaks into fragments of emotion, interest, and division. But if order becomes too rigid a mold, human beings will suffocate inside the very house they have built. Qin Shi Huang's story, therefore, does not tell us to choose one side and forget the other. It tells us to remember that the greatest power is not making everything identical, but creating a common structure strong enough to endure, while still leaving room for human life to breathe. And then at last, perhaps the deepest lesson remains the lesson of the limit of power. Qin Shi Huang accomplished what many in his own age must have thought impossible. He unified all under heaven. He cast the mold for a country. He left behind an imprint long enough that 2,000 years later, people still speak of him. Yet he still could not overcome the one thing every human being must one day meet: death. He searched for the elixir of immortality, traveled on imperial tours, listened to the promises of the Fangxi, hoping to preserve his life as long as the dream of empire itself. And yet in the end he was given only one brief human life. Like every other person, here, history becomes both very gentle and very real. It reminds us that human beings may build great works, establish great laws, and alter the fate of an entire great land. But no one can unite his own fate with immortality. No one can command time to stop. And for that reason, the greatest legacy of power does not lie in living forever, but in creating something real enough, deep enough, and solid enough in form to continue existing after one has departed. Qin Shi Huang did not live as long as he wished. The Qin dynasty, too, did not endure as long as the dream of 10,000 generations he once imagined. But the political form he helped bring into being proved far more enduring than his own life. And that is what makes this story belong not only to the past, it belongs to every age. Still, asking, how does one build a nation? How does one keep it from breaking apart? And how does one prevent constructive strength from becoming a crushing weight upon the human heart? Perhaps when the night has deepened and history recedes like the sound of ancient wheels upon an old stone road, we will understand Qin Shi Huang in a calmer way, not only as the first emperor, not only as a conqueror, but as a very long reminder that there are people who do not live only in their own age. They also leave behind a mold for the centuries that follow. And the wisdom of posterity is neither to bow before everything in that mold, nor to reject it entirely, but to learn how to see clearly what within it helped give birth to a nation, and what within it reminds us to keep the heart soft enough that power does not turn order into silence. And like a final breeze passing through the eaves and then growing still, the story of Qin Shi Huang closes here, not noisily, not with hurried judgment, but leaving behind in the night one thought both light and enduring. There are empires built of iron and stone, yet their greatest lesson lies in the way later generations learn the balance between strength, limit, and human compassion.